300 targets, 3 separate nights, 1 single week. The United States has now struck Iran 3 times since Tuesday, and each round followed the exact same script. Iran hits a ship, Washington hits back harder, and somehow both sides keep calling this a ceasefire. On Saturday night, Iran didn't just attack another tanker. It declared the entire Strait of Hormuz closed, indefinitely, to all shipping. I want to walk through exactly how we got from a signed peace agreement to 3 full nights of airstrikes in a single week, because the pattern driving this escalation is more mechanical and more predictable than either government seems willing to admit. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll cover the specific incident that triggered Saturday's third round of strikes, the scale and targets of all 3 rounds this week, Iran's response, an indefinite closure of Hormuz and fresh attacks on Gulf allies, the increasingly personal war of words between Trump and Iran's government, and the quiet diplomatic track that's somehow still functioning underneath all of this. This isn't really a story about which side is right. It's a story about a ceasefire that's being enforced entirely through retaliation instead of restraint. Let's start with the specific incident, because CENTCOM's own statement lays out the sequence in unusually direct language. On Saturday, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fired on the meter-per-volt GF's Galaxy, a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The IRG's own version, released through SIPA News, framed this as a warning shot at a vessel using an unauthorized route, part of Iran's broader claim that ships using the American-backed corridor near Oman, rather than Iran's designated route, are subject to enforcement. Whatever the intent, the ship caught fire, sustained what CENTCOM called significant engine room damage, and 1 crew member went missing. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre confirmed the crew was forced to abandon ship via lifeboat. CENTCOM's response statement is worth reading closely, because it explicitly frames this as the culmination of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Iran was provided yet another opportunity to demonstrate adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding after being held accountable for earlier attacks on commercial vessels, but has again failed. That's the Pentagon publicly stating that this wasn't Iran's first chance to comply. It was its third documented failure to do so this week alone, each one met with a fresh round of American strikes. Here's the cumulative picture, and the numbers by themselves tell you how quickly this has escalated. CENTCOM confirmed that Saturday's strikes hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets, using precision munitions launched from land and sea-based fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, hitting missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's public reaction was characteristically blunt. Iran made a poor choice. Now they pay. But Saturday's strikes weren't an isolated event. According to CENTCOM's own tally, across 3 separate nights this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday, the United States struck more than 300 targets total inside Iran. A U.S. official told CBS News that Iranian railways used to transport military supplies were specifically among the targets hit earlier in the week. Trump had set the tone for this entire sequence on Wednesday, telling reporters, "I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum," immediately before ordering that second round of strikes. 300 targets, 3 nights, 1 week, is not the profile of a ceasefire experiencing occasional friction. It's the profile of a war that paused for roughly 3 weeks and then resumed at a pace matching its opening days. Iran's response to Saturday's strikes went well beyond rhetoric. Shortly before the American strikes even began, Iran's Zerg Navy announced it would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed to all shipping indefinitely, until the United States ended what it called its illegal interventions in the region, and vowed to strike us bases in response to any further aggression. That's a meaningful shift in language. Previous closures and disputes had focused on specific routes or specific ships. An indefinite blanket closure is Iran abandoning the pretense of selective enforcement altogether. Iran followed through within hours. The way's National Emergency Crisis and Disaster Management Authority reported its air defense systems were actively engaging a missile threat, urging citizens to remain in safe locations. Qatar's Ministry of Defense said its armed forces intercepted a number of ballistic missile attacks. Kuwait's army said it had confronted hostile aerial targets in its airspace. According to Iranian state media, a member of Iran's Parliamentary National Security Committee had already warned, days earlier, that the way would pay the price for its cooperation with the United States, accusing the Emirates of a behind-the-scenes role in facilitating the American strikes. Within the same 24-hour period, 3 separate Gulf nations, all hosting or supporting US military operations, found themselves directly targeted. Alongside the military exchanges, the public rhetoric between the two governments has escalated in its own right, and it's worth tracking separately because it reveals how personally both leaderships now seem to be treating this conflict. Trump's scum comment on Wednesday wasn't a one-off. He had already declared the entire memorandum of understanding over earlier that same week, before reportedly agreeing on Friday to a request from Iran to continue talks anyway, an inconsistency that itself signals how fluid Washington's actual position has become from day to day. Iran's own senior officials have matched that intensity. We've covered elsewhere how Kalibaf, Iran's chief negotiator, posted directly that if you strike, you'll get hit, and how Iran's security chief Zolgadar warned that any attack on Iranian infrastructure would be answered with strikes on Israel specifically. That combination, a negotiator publicly threatening the U.S. while simultaneously continuing talks, and a security official threatening Israel on a completely separate track, tells you Iran's own government is not speaking with one unified voice about how to handle this moment, any more than Washington is. Here's the detail that gets lost in coverage of the strikes themselves. Despite 3 rounds of American airstrikes and an indefinite Iranian closure of Hormuz, actual diplomatic engagement between Washington and Tehran has not stopped. 3 separate sources told CBS News that active conversations between the two governments were continuing throughout this same period, mediated indirectly through Qatar. Multiple officials confirmed that Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, have been personally working the phones to keep this channel alive. This is the genuinely strange feature of this entire week. Military escalation and active diplomacy are running simultaneously on parallel tracks rather than one replacing the other. The Memorandum of Understanding itself was designed to run until roughly August 18th, and despite Trump publicly declaring it over multiple times this week, both governments still appear to be operating as if the underlying framework remains intact, and the incentive to eventually reach a permanent deal that's either a sign of genuine, if badly strained, commitment to ending this conflict, or a sign that both sides have simply concluded that talking and striking are no longer mutually exclusive. That you can bomb a country's military infrastructure on a Tuesday and still be negotiating with its government by Friday. Put this entire week together and a specific, repeatable mechanism emerges. Iran, or an element within its security apparatus, strikes a commercial vessel. The United States responds with a set number of military targets, larger each time. While insisting this is accountability, not new war, Iran responds to that retaliation with its own strikes on Gulf states hosting American forces, while its negotiators simultaneously continue talking to Washington through Qatari intermediaries. Both governments escalate their public rhetoric in parallel with the military exchanges, each side publicly framing the other as the party that broke faith first, and underneath all of it, the actual diplomatic process, however battered, keeps running. This isn't a ceasefire collapsing into open war. It's a ceasefire being renegotiated through violence, incident by incident, with both sides seemingly betting that the underlying framework can survive an amount of mutual damage that would have ended most previous agreements outright. So here's the question worth sitting with. If 3 rounds of strikes, over 300 targets, an indefinite closure of one of the world's most important waterways, and direct attacks on 3 separate Gulf allies, all happened within a single week, and diplomatic talks are still somehow continuing through all of it, what does that actually tell you about how both governments define a ceasefire at this point? Because based on this week alone, the answer increasingly looks like this: a framework flexible enough to survive nightly airstrikes as long as nobody officially declares it dead, even when the person running the strikes has already called it exactly that.